I was like, I'll get that started.
You're good.
All right. Well, hi everyone. Good morning. This is our third and final event. I know a lot of you have been able to make a few of them. For the new faces, welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. My name is Eric Berry.
I'm Barb Thies.
We are both graduate students at the Humphrey School, and we are so excited to have you here this morning for our final event in a series we're calling the Swain Climate Action Breakfast Briefings. The goal of these events has really been to take you along from local climate action. The next event focused on kind of state level climate action. And today we're joined with three amazing panelists. We're going to talk more about kind of the regional initiatives and the national initiatives and how we can plug in to climate action on that level. So our panelists today, we have Jade Drake Hamilton. She is the Senior Director of Science Policy at Fresh Energy. Sarah Goodspeed, she is the Senior Youth and Policy Manager at Climate Generation, and Anna Dirkschwager, the Climate and Energy Director for the Midwest Division at the Nature Conservancy. We're welcomed by Professor Gabe Chan. He will be moderating this morning. Without further ado, let's welcome our panelists, and Gabe, turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, everyone in the room and online. Hello. Thanks for joining us here. I think we have a really exciting panel, and thanks to Eric and Barb for planning this amazing breakfast for everyone. So I want to start by just going down the line. It's a short introduction. I want to give you all a chance to tell us your climate origin story. How did you get into climate? So we'll start with Jade.
Okay, in college I went to Dartmouth, and that's when I first heard about climate change and global warming. And I kept my notebooks from there. And so I could look up the year when I learned about climate change. And I looked over my notes many years ago when I first started this job at Fresh Energy. And I found 90% of what I learned is still true. And there's been magnificent accelerations in knowledge about the other 10%. But I learned about this when I was a sophomore in college. And I always knew it, had it in the back of my mind. And I became a geographer and was headed to academia. And I wound up teaching at George Washington University in DC. I had graduate students and undergrads. And I got to choose what I taught. So I often taught about energy policy and global change and global warming. So that was perfect for me. And then one year in 1995, I was keeping an eye on what was going on in the media and politics here in Minnesota. And in 1995, I kept catching, I don't know if they were figments of my imagination, but I was catching an interest across Minnesota in making a transition in the energy system, which is the bulwark of what we need to do to solve the climate problem. And it really caught my interest. I had never done policy, but then I remembered, oh yeah, I had a policy studies minor in college too. And so I did have policy studies. And I loved the job. I was always afraid that I would miss teaching because there's tons of colleges around, and I knew I could pick up a class whenever I wanted to. And I raised this with a friend of mine here in Minnesota, and she said, "You're teaching every day, Jay. You're just teaching state legislators." And it's really commonplace to use the same tricks I use in classrooms to catch the attention of legislators too. That's my story.
I love hearing that, as long as we work together to learn new things all the time. And good morning, I'm Sarah, and I work with Climate Generation. I came into climate work through more of an environmental justice pathway. When I was in college, I'm from Minnesota, but I went to California for college and learned about a lot of community organizing there. Very humbling to compare it with what we have in Minnesota is a very different kind of organizing with our labor movements, our farm workers, versus California. And then I moved to Ecuador, and I saw powerful changes that communities were able to make because they had such strong policy in place that allowed them that gave them more tools to protect their communities from contamination. And so I came home to Minnesota really recommitted to organize in my own communities, in my own town. So I came here to the Humphrey School, and I was a step for any steps out there. And really learned how, look around at all these buildings, they're full of people who have incredible solutions, and really wanted to learn how do we create the policies that enable us to realize those solutions in our communities. And so I started working with the state, doing a lot of voter outreach, so that we're really having those conversations in our communities about how we're taking our power and how we're shaping our communities around us. And slowly that grew into shifting into the nonprofit sector, doing environmental justice research at Swain, and for the last 4 years now at Climate Generation, where we get to teach. We work with young people, primarily high schoolers, who are really pushing for those solutions that we have and we know, and they're pushing to make the political reality possible so that we can achieve those.
I love that. I love both of those stories. I have always been an environmental advocate. I honestly don't know what prompted it. I have very clear memories and still like in a memory box of signed photos of George W. Bush and then Clinton. And I remember writing letters at a young age asking for, like what little kids are concerned about, like the rainforest being cut down, and that bothered me. So I decided I needed to write. And I still to this day sort of have that like passion for environmental advocacy, but I think that's just what started with me at a young age. Similar to Jay, I actually thought I wanted to teach, and I've always been a huge outdoor nerd. And so I went to college at St. Mary's University in Winona because they have an awesome environmental biology program, and I could be in the bluffs and on the Mississippi River and looking at invertebrates. And I thought that was the route for creating the systems change that I wanted. Had a lot of twists. I took a year off and studied in Australia so I could do more of marine invertebrates. And during that time, I was like, no, I need to do law. Like, that's the best way to be effective. Got ready to go to law school and paused again and decided that maybe wasn't the best career path. And so I actually took a job at 3M here, focused on microbiology, and it was a good experience, sort of a corporate application for systems sustainability, and it bought me time to think about what I wanted to do next. I went back to grad school at U of M with a focus in economics and environmental policy, and landed a job at the DNR that was really focused on the state's response to the ethanol crisis and how we were going to handle that for our forest sector as well. And that gave me about a decade of state-based policy experience and working with industry and our natural resource sectors. And I loved that because it wasn't maybe your traditional climate approach, but the more twists and turns I've had, the more I see how climate transcends, every sector that is a part of our life. Eventually, I decided that I needed to change from the state, so I went to work for a couple of different nonprofits. I spent a little bit of time representing wind and solar industries at the legislature, doing some work with Jay, and then from there, I'm now at the Nature Conservancy, where my job is really to drive climate policy throughout the broader Midwest. And so, as you all can imagine, the Midwest is full of opportunity, and it's also challenging politically, right? And so it's always about building that bipartisan base and communicating the importance of climate in every facet of our life. And there are days where I think I would like to maybe go to teaching instead and pause from policy for a bit. But it's that passion, right? Which is probably the same reason you're here. Like, it can be hard, but like it's the thing you wake up every day and it has to be done. Or we all fail. So that's why I do what I do.
Sarah, I want to go to you first with this question and then go to everyone else. But I was looking at a public opinion poll, I mentioned this at the very beginning when we were chatting, of people under 35 are the most disillusioned they've been since they've been asking questions about how do you feel about politics, how do you feel about our institutions. And I think a lot of that reflects gridlock in Washington or in state capitals. What is it like to do climate policy in a world where our politics are so gridlocked and young people feel like maybe politics hand in hand?
That, yes, big question. And as someone who works with young people, especially with high school age young people, teaching about the different pathways to make change is really powerful, and being able to build a community of people who care about this issue just as much as you do, so that you know that you're not alone and you're not staring into this void and screaming with no one listening and no one reflecting what you're calling for. It can be really hard when you're not, getting results from your legislators and from your congresspeople. But when students are coming together, the reason I am able to feel so strongly and so hopeful is because we're seeing them take action every single day. And acting is the most important way to combat those feelings of disillusionment. When you're feeling hopeless, come together, build that community, take small actions. And our students are also seeing real results. When you're building those small actions, you're also building towards that collective action and collective impact. And so we're seeing legislators who named our students, not our own students, but the student climate movement as why they started climate caucuses in the State House and Senate, because they're seeing these demands and they're trying to honor what students are saying. But yeah, it's really hard. We know we have champions and we're really grateful for them, and we have their back when they have our backs.
Yeah, the gridlock. What a way to start the day. I guess I kind of think of it like good news, bad news. Bad news, I saw probably what many of us have suspected, but a couple months back, NPR ran an article that was titled something like The Big Sort. And so it talked about how COVID, did you see that? Yeah. Has heightened, people are moving to areas of like-mindedness, right? And so our cities, our municipalities are becoming more polarized than they ever were. And the troubling part about that increase in polarization is that the political cover then for doing anything that's not moderate or anything that's less extreme isn't there, right? Your base is becoming more extreme in their viewpoint. And so that's the bad news. The good news is that the majority of Americans want to see action on climate policy and feel that what we're doing is not enough. Pew Research Center will say 2/3 of Americans feel that they can see the effects of climate change happening and they expect more from the federal government. It's over 50% of Republicans and the majority of Democrats. And so while you do see that increase in polarization, I think the importance of wanting climate action and climate becoming less polarized, that's the good news. That's the opportunity I see. And I think a large part of that is similar to Sarah's work and others, and that's this is the necessity for grassroots conversations. We have to talk about climate, and especially from a values point of view, in more parts of our life. We have to be comfortable talking about the fact that we're having snow that's sitting on the ground today as I drove in with our neighbors, and what does that mean? I don't have to convince my neighbor that climate change is real, but I have to talk about how that impacts me personally, which is hey, where are the bees we just got? How are we going to struggle to find food? And then my apple trees aren't going to be as efficient this summer. So I think about things like that, but that opportunity with the climate sort of permeating all of these sectors and becoming less partisan, that's the good news piece, but I do feel we have that responsibility to continue that grassroots momentum.
Yeah, I just signed a bunch of letters this week, fundraising letters, to our members. And somebody had put on this cartoon on the top of the letter, which I'd never seen before, and it said, "Fresh energy, policy solutions are our superpower." And I love that.
Yeah.
I was very proud to sign that. Because the truth is, we are closer now than ever before to enacting the solutions. Mm-hmm. So I think one thing that is missing so far is we need to read more real news about the really strong work that's been being done on solutions. And we do that at Fresh Energy. And I'll give you an example. In the past 2 years, I've been on a lot of Zoom meetings like you have. And sometimes when I see a lot of young people on the meeting, I want to switch to their question, which is, what can we possibly do? Should we just quit school and go do something else? No. And I always start them off with this story. Did you know in December 2020, then President Trump signed a bill that was the biggest thing the US Congress had ever passed in 11 years? Did you know that? That is the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. It's the AIM Act. Why is that important? Because I was working on the state level version of that law in Minnesota for a couple of years, trying to talk to state legislators about it. And the people I was working with in Washington, D.C. were also working on it. And they passed the law with bipartisan support in October or November 2020. And what is this law? It says there's something called hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. They are known as super polluters. They are responsible for about 0.5 degree Celsius of warming that we're expecting. That's about 1/3 of what we need to cut out. We need to phase down HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. They are primarily used in refrigeration and in air conditioning. But here's the beauty of it. There are substitutes to these super pollutants, so you don't need to continue using them. And the substitutes are all cheaper and all are made in the US. So you're not asking people who run businesses using HFCs to do anything that is not in their best interest. And I went and talked to some people in Washington, D.C. too. And we got this law passed because it requires us to phase down by 85% hydrofluorocarbons in now 14 years. EPA is writing the regulations right now. President Trump signed this bipartisan law. And you know who else supported it? It was the first climate legislation that I've ever known the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to support. Because look at it, the substitutes are here. The substitutes are cheaper than HFCs. They're made in America. And if we join the rest of the world, and that means join in on the Kigali Agreement, which was also worked out in 2015, same time as the Paris Agreement. Every other country is a part of the Kigali Agreement. Now you may have seen these two pieces of news because the HFC phase down in law was on the front page of the New York Times, the front page of the Star Tribune. And so I look at all the students in my audience and say, that's why you should also glance at that now and then. And you're going to be heartened by that. But get this, we are now talking about joining the Kigali Agreement, and it's going to pass a vote in the Congress. So when all countries are in this, we are going to save 0.5 degree Celsius. We'll be 1/3 of the way of where we need to be. So that is good news. And I have lots of solutions like that. That's why I go to work in a good mood every day, because I learn about fantastic things that are going on. And maybe later I can tell you what I know is happening in the U.S. Department of Energy. And it is amazing. But I'm just going to leave it at this. The number of people, brilliant people, who've decided to give up their very cushy job in a foundation in America or in an academic post in America and decided to jump at the call of President Biden and move their families to Washington, D.C. And they are now working today. About 150 of them, brilliant people, are working full-time in the basement of the White House by Gina McCarthy, who's in charge of domestic climate policy. At least that's what it was about a year ago. I don't know how many are there. There's an equitable number of people who go to work on international negotiations, and they're working for John Kerry. That means that if you track it down through all the agencies, almost every agency in the Biden administration is also working on climate change. And if you hear what they're doing, they have targets that they must meet on a specific timeline and with a specific budget. Now, this is the Department of Energy, so these are very large budgets. They have to spend a very large amount of money and get things done. That's what gives me the hope that we should go on. And I encourage every young person I talk to get in this game. Because President Biden was right when he spoke to us at COP26. Because he finished his remarks and he said, and now I'm talking to the young people in the room. And he said, not just everyone in your generation, but most of the people in every generation that exists will spend probably the bulk of their lives doing something that in part will be a solution to climate change. So you shouldn't give up. You should train yourself up and get ready to go out and help us all solve this problem.
And I want to go to you next and ask the question, what is climate policy? We are here on the third one of these breakfasts. Our first one was about local. What can we do at the local scale? Our second one was about state. And here we're talking about national and regional. And the reason I think this question is interesting because I think for a long time, when I got started in climate policy was comprehensive cap and trade. And that was going to be, everyone who was working on climate, which was admittedly a small fraction of who's working on it now, was just focused on let's pass this comprehensive federal policy. And when that failed, I think what happened was a lot of other places started doing climate policy. And then similarly with Paris, when the Trump administration announced that they were going to pull out of Paris, we started seeing this we're still in movement with a lot of other people started working on climate policy. So the question is, what is climate policy and how does it all work together?
That's a big one. I feel like that's a
Only
whole
big
lecture,
questions.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, at a simplistic level, there's part of me that would say almost everything is climate policy or should be at this point. The Nature Conservancy's approach and belief is that we are very much for bipartisan, durable, long-standing policy. And so we're not in it to see large swings. We want something that's going to last. And I think absent large sweeping federal legislation, we very much recognize the importance of both federal policy, but state policy and policy that transcends every sector. So, for example, I split my time between working on things like passing the infrastructure bill and looking at language that we're proposing in things like Build Back Better, but also looking at, the Farm Bill and the energy title and what does that mean for our Minnesota farmers and our communities here, and how could those programs be made more effective to address a lot of the climate impacts and also be proactive on the mitigation side with the effects here in Minnesota. Jay pointed out the AIM passage. I think about also things related to carbon capture, and when we look at industrial process-based emissions, we look at the transportation sector. I think we are well past a point where there aren't trade-offs with a lot of solutions, but that also we have the time and we have the technology to pass the solutions. And so when I say that, when I ask the question what isn't climate policy, I guess what I'm asking you all to do and what we're doing is to say there needs to be that lens of what is the relevant climate portion in almost any policy we're passing, because we're going to feel it and we're going to have to deal with it and we're going to have to be proactive about it. And so buildings, transportation, power sector, those are all of the areas that we are diving in deep. The industrial sector, because they all play a piece of mitigating below that 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so we are looking at the potential for climate impacts in all of those. Obviously, we're the Nature Conservancy, so we also are a big fan of nature-based solutions and looking at the impact to deploy plants that suck up CO2 to mitigate climate change. And so we're looking at the role and what that means for places where we can use nature to play a part of the a part of the climate change solution as well.
Yeah, I am gonna keep expanding that. Everything is climate policy because, at the Humphrey School, we have students working in education, housing, public safety, all impacted by climate change. And so even not looking beyond the mitigation of greenhouse gas and the adaptation that we can do in our communities, but also like those intersections across all those different areas, making sure that we're taking a comprehensive view of how our future is changing and how our communities are impacted across those issues. And we have really loved working with We Are Still In. Has been a coalition of local governments, businesses, private actors across a lot of different sectors about trying to move forward these solutions in all of our places, especially in the lack of federal leadership. And a lot of those solutions are still moving forward. Thinking of market solutions, yes, we're at the precipice. A lot of climate solutions are inevitable. They just make sense and they're here and we just need to open the doors. But at the same time, from a justice perspective, not all of the solutions that we need are going to make money. Not all of the solutions that we need are going to be profitable. And that's why we're at the Humphrey School and not the Carlson School. And how are we actually looking at our communities and building in the legal infrastructure and the social infrastructure that is actually making sure that all of these solutions are reflecting what our communities really need and that we're being held accountable to those most impacted who are shaping what those solutions look like.
In our democracy, Fresh Energy supports policy because policy makes things permanent, or as close to permanent as you can possibly get. So, and since our mission is to get to Minnesota and the region in a position that we have equitable, carbon neutral economies, we need a lot of policies. And I recently did something in my office and in my head, which has a lot of this information. I just counted up roughly how many policy solutions do we need to do. And it's something like 1,000 on that order. So there's plenty of work to be done. And President Biden was elected on a climate platform, largely. And it was a two-part platform. It was split into two to get through our Congress. And the first part sailed through, relatively, the bipartisan infrastructure law. But that touches less than 5% of the climate policy that needs to get done. So the part that our U.S. Senator Tina Smith wrote was called Build Back Better, and it is now called the Federal Climate Package. And it still needs to be passed because that roughly 95% of the action and investments that are going to influence the climate actions that are going to put themselves to work here in Minnesota and all over the country has to pass. So the new climate investments would put about $500 billion into the states. And the analysis I've seen recently that I was talking about in Duluth just a week ago was that that would mean for Minnesota, in the next 5 years, if that climate investments passes in Congress, it will mean in 5 years, Minnesota will get 90,000 at least new jobs. Who can be against that? And also, every family will save about $7,500 a year in energy costs, every year. And guess what? Single parent households will save about $15,000 in energy costs a year. So these are big stakes, and they really hit people locally in Minnesota, but we'll need the federal action to help that happen. And that's why a week ago, I was not in Duluth really, I was there virtually for this press conference. And it was the best press conference I've ever seen done in Duluth. And it was about the need to pass this federal law in Congress. here's why it was important. Because I was talking about how much the households would save and how many jobs we'd get. And leading my press conference was Senator Jen McEwen, who represents Duluth. And she was excellent. And she was joined by a doctor in Superior, Wisconsin, who knew all the health impacts that needed to be tamped down. And he spoke eloquently. And guess what? When I saw the spreadsheet of all the news coverage we got 12 TV news stories, averaging between 2 and 4 minutes on our little press release. Fox, CBS TV, ABC TV, NBC TV. In Duluth, they did a total of 12 stories. They covered it on the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, the 9 o'clock news, and the 10 o'clock news, and it was the lead story. And I watched all those clips, and I saw that every one of those newsrooms based in Duluth had a video library of climate change coverage, documenting how Duluth and Superior were changing for the worst. I had never seen anything like that, and I've been doing my job about 25 years. They always had to call someone up and get coverage. They had their own coverage. And you bet those we're sending those clips to all the members of the Minnesota legislature, because they need to reach out to Senator Klobuchar and Senator Smith, who have also already done a great job on clean energy. And now they need to make sure that this law needs to pass as quickly as possible. That's why policy is so important. I'll give you an indication of how we use local media to help us tell that story.
So I want to make sure we have time for everyone else's questions. So start thinking of your questions. This will be my last one. But coming back to where we started on climate origin stories, we have a lot of people in the room who are grad students or who work with students. What would you say to them? Take this opportunity to directly address some of the students in the room who are looking to move their careers into climate work.
All right, so I'm from an energy policy group, and I do the climate policy, but we all do both of those things. So what moves us to do work, and should move all of you, is that we started out talking about energy, and it was a hard slog, and maybe Anna remembers this too, because the only thing that people had in their heads when they thought about energy coming to rural Minnesota, this was way before wind turbines, big wind turbines, and way before even solar installations. That was when people still remembered what rural electric co-ops did for them. They electrified rural Minnesota, and that was absolutely essential. And after that point, after the 30s and 40s and 50s, people all over the world, I think, stopped thinking about energy because they had energy, it was cheap for most people, and most of the people didn't even know the name of their utility. And many more of them didn't know where their electricity was coming from. And so we needed to do a lot of education. And we used to talk, when we were talking about wind energy and then solar energy, and electric vehicles, which we're all talking about every single day. We started out by talking about the transition to new energy. We hope to get more and more people interested in energy itself. And we made it abundantly clear to most people, she's no longer talking about transition, because Jay always uses the term transformation. Because what used to be a boring sector, energy, or a moribund sector, because nobody knew, for decades and decades, nobody knew anything better than to just burn fossil fuels for most of it. And now, the solutions, wind and solar, are in most cases the cheapest and cleanest solution. So that is a transformation. So I say to anyone who wants to get involved in this, you don't necessarily need to work in the energy sector. You can work in the finance sector. You can work in sustainability for a company. You can do anything, because all of these policies, these 1,000 that I mentioned, I don't know if that's the right number, but it's a lot more than one. And every audiences I've talked to all over Minnesota, there's always been at least one person who says, what's the one thing we should be doing? And I have to say, we all need to do parts of everything. All of these changes need to happen. And some of them are going to be pilots. And it's okay that some of the pilots will fail. Because pilots in agriculture and in forestry and in carbon capture and storage and direct air capture of carbon, some of those pilots will fail. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be funding them. We are now funding them. And we have to hope that some of them work, because everything needs to work.
I can't wait to see where I'll be with 25 years of experience doing this work. I was in your seats 10 years ago, and you've heard from all of us that we've done different, worked in different sectors and had different pathways, and I really love that message. Like, whichever pathway you take, you can do climate policy, whatever sector you're going into, whatever issue areas you work with, it's all climate. And to really think of how you're rooting your work in, what does science demand, what does justice demand, is the work that I'm doing, helping to meet that, helping to get us to that level. And feeling that urgency that there's always more that we can do, wherever you are, do what you can with what you have. We work a lot at the local level, we work with school districts. You can have such a huge impact at that hyper-local level. We work at the national level, at the international level. We had an amazing conversation earlier this week with ACE partners. So this is part of the Paris Agreement that the US still has to live up to our part. But it's really about how are we engaging communities in solutions. And it's not just policymakers, it's how are we bringing our entire communities into this work with us. And sharing that across communities, across the globe. We had just partners, teaching students so that you don't have to go to college to learn about climate change. Talk about it with people who are young, talk about it with people who don't know much about climate change. See it wherever you go and look for ways to have that impact.
I fully agree with both of those statements. I will be more practical, or not practical, specific maybe. First, thank you is my first. Thank you for choosing to be a voice and wanting to do this work. And the second thing I guess that I would offer is, to a note sort of what Jay was saying, I would say we have to change, and we are in the middle of transforming our energy economy, right? But there's definitely still a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is that literacy about how we get our energy, be it transportation, be it buildings, be it power, be it industrial, is not fully there, and we don't have enough people working on it. And so I guess you are all in the Humphrey School, and so my recommendation is the more you can pair a policy lens with specific experience in like a tangible sector, like that is going to be invaluable, because it's exactly what we need to make these transformations. And so that application of what that means locally and in which sector paired with like a policy lens, and that experience can come in a variety of different ways, but I think that's a really valuable pairing to have right now. There are a lot of folks that just have worked in policy, and there are a lot of folks that have maybe more traditional engineering or science backgrounds, and we are past the point where these things live in silos. They transcend one another, and the more you build those skills and mesh those profiles early on, like, you are invaluable then in this career field, because you can see both of the applications. So I was going to suggest that. There was something else. Oh, and then I was going to echo what Sarah said, and that is like, talk about it. We have to get comfortable talking about it with everybody all the time. And that's my ask that I make all the time to my neighbors. Maybe I put myself into exile in my neighborhood, maybe not, but but I really do believe that we have to be more comfortable talking about the role of climate in our everyday lives in order to increase that bipartisan support and action.
All right, let's turn it out to you all for your questions. Devin.
So for climate generation, I'm really curious. You do a lot with climate education in schools. So I used to volunteer with climate generation a number of years ago, doing tabling and events, and advocating for you guys, and I loved it. I'm wondering, what's your scope of schools that you're working with now, and how are you planning on, or are you planning on expanding that to more rural area schools? And what would be the ways that we could help expand that educational knowledge out to the schools that really need it?
Thank you. Oh my gosh. And I get really excited to work with people who are in this work, helping to do that in every way. So thanks for your support. And we work with educators across North America, and we have an annual summer institute. We're constantly building out our network of educators, and primarily for K-12 educators, but also non-formal educators. I'm really just so honored to be part of that work and how we're supporting people who are in the classroom, are working with people every single day about how we're incorporating climate change and that learning in our own communities. Now my brain is going elsewhere. But ways that we're building out, especially in Minnesota, we actually have a really big project next year where we're going to be doing some regional educator training that's funded by the LCCMR, so thank you for another policy string. It's all interconnected, and so that's really supporting us to support educators to talk about green careers in the classroom, talk about climate change across content areas, and we're going to be able to support hundreds of educators to be a part of this work with us. Because with our North American network, we support cohorts of teachers to learn from one another. What's working in your classroom? What are you hearing in your communities? What are some barriers, especially today? Teachers really need, just like our students do, teachers really need that support system of peers to help work through a lot of challenges. Schools are really on the front line of a lot of work right now. And so being able to support teachers to have those hard conversations, to feel confidence in what they're teaching and have the resources and backup from one another and from us and just a lot of expertise that we're able to lean on with other partners.
I'd just like to build on what Sarah said. It's a great story, because what I know in all my experience of talking about climate change is you should talk about the impacts no more than 10% of your time. 90% of your time you should be talking about the solutions, and you should have the people in rural Minnesota who are leading those solutions. And here's a great example. I don't use my Facebook hardly at all anymore, but I posted something on the Facebook just last week or 2 weeks ago when I heard that the U.S. Department of Energy had come forward with $700,000 for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe to build solar. And I posted it, and I know a neighbor of mine just moved to Leech Lake from St. Paul. He was the first person to love that, because he said, you'll be able to see some of this when you come up tomorrow. I'm going to go up there and visit him and his wife. And what I'll be looking for is, what are the young people in the Leech Lake Band who can bring elders in with them to talk to the media about what they're doing, and that this is working in Minnesota, for rural Minnesota, and for indigenous people, and many others. That's a lifelong lesson for everyone. And you should lead with stories like that all the time.
I think you have time for one more. Yeah, I think.
I have a question that kind of bridges
what you guys were both talking about relating to education and also kind of like political favorability. I'm curious to know what role you see like trade education playing in this, like skilled solar installers or career transitioning, because that seems like a very, potentially a very strong like bipartisan area that could have a lot of benefits. And I'm just curious to see between like more policy, political, and education side, what you guys think about that.
I'm excited to jump in, but.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, it needed, right, so like there, like, CJ, the Clean Energy Jobs Act 2.0 in Illinois, like, one of the things I love about some of these policies is that they build in the requirement for trade and as a way to build in community support and deliver benefits as these marginalized communities transition away from coal and fossil fuels. And so policies that incorporate that sort of trade, I think not only are desperately needed, but the union jobs angle for building political support is another key component that I would just highlight.
I get very excited talking about green jobs because we work with so many educators and and we really want to support students, you know, in a lot of different pathways, whatever their skills and interests, and especially thinking of trades and skilled trades like that is an incredibly ripe area. The 90,000 jobs Jay was talking about are often in the skilled trades, the way that they're breaking down a lot of that research. Obviously, any job can be a green job, but yes, working with how are we supporting students to get into those sectors, apprenticeships, how are we collaborating with technical colleges. I also serve on the board of REAL, the Rural Renewable Energy Alliance. I highly encourage folks to consider being on boards of nonprofits. We need your help, and you also learn so much. And working with REAL, they're also supporting internships. They work with the White Earth Nation, actually, so very close by to Leech Lake, and doing internships to train students in solar energy. And then they hire them at REAL to be part of their installation team. And just really closing the loop on, you know, educating students about climate change and what are the solutions that they can be a part of, and actually, you know, bringing them into those sectors is just such an exciting way to make sure that we're extending that work so that everyone's part of those solutions.
And when I was getting ready to go to COP26 and represent Fresh Energy, I had just created a map of the 12-state Midwest region. And what it showed is 26% of the emissions of greenhouse gases in the US come from those 12 states in the Midwest. And the first person I went to come with me to COP26 was Governor J.B. Pritzker of Illinois, because he had just signed the best law in the nation at the time. And he mentioned twice in his press release how he was focusing on Black and brown people in those jobs. So he brought that message to the global audience. And we needed to do that because everyone else, the other 40,000 people at COP26 with us, are from 196 other countries. And I know because I've been there 6 times now to the climate summits. And every time someone wants to have coffee with me or lunch with me, because they know I'm from Minnesota, and they want to tell me very fervently, you know, Jay, they always call me Jay right away, because they've known me for a long time. You know, Jay, it really doesn't matter what the people on the most liberal coast of California do on policy. And it doesn't matter what the most liberal people in Massachusetts do. There's 4 states we're looking at. And this is because these 40,000 people know their geography and especially know their political geography. And the 4 states they mention is what we're thinking about is going to move Congress to action, is largely starting in those 4 states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois. And that is what Gina McCarthy, who used to run the EPA, says from the basement of the White House every day to the public. It's those 4 states that matter the most. So if you're going to be working with young people, with people in labor labor in any of those 4 states. The reason we want to get those clean energy jobs here, and we want to save all those families money here, is because we know it'll help us get federal legislation passed.
So stay here.
Yeah. Yeah, don't look out at the snow.
Mind yourself.
Well, I want to please join me in thanking this amazing panel. We're going to have some time for mingling. I'm going to pass it over to Barb and Eric in just a minute, but let's thank our panelists.
Thank you all so much for coming today, for leading the conversation, and for the work that you all do. And thank all of you for coming, especially those of you who made it out to 2 or 3 of these. With it being the last one today, we put these together as a way to get the conversation around climate action going here on campus. And so, kind of to echo what Anna said, we really hope that you bring this outside of Humphrey, outside of the U, continue these discussions and conversations in your communities and your social circles, because that is just such an important piece, which we also heard from Catherine Hayhoe, anyone who attended her session on Tuesday as well. So with that, we do have this time at the end for you all to connect with one another and with our panelists who are excited to meet you all, and we've got lots of food and drinks in the back. So you know the drill. I'm going to challenge you all to talk to somebody you don't know, at least one person, before you go today. And again, thanks everybody for coming.
And be aware that we are hiring people. We're going to be hiring people throughout 2022. So take our newsletters there, sign up for our monthly list, and we will tell you in 1-page email what you can do to take action.
There you go.
Please sign up for it.
And also, please join me in thanking Eric and Barb for one of the best student round events.
I'm very well. How are you?
So, that's fantastic.